So much for having me. So I did very recently complete an MRes in curatorial knowledge here, so this is a very familiar place to me. Daylighting was a collaborative, so we'll come back to this. Paul's just raised some very interesting questions about the term fascism, but I think we'll come back to that when we get to the project in more detail. So Daylighting was a collaborative platform that took place at the Wellcome in October this year. It was a program that asked how we might breach or intervene on archives and systems of knowledge to think about how we change narratives and amplify new voices. At its core was the production of a newspaper called Daylight, and that was a paper that explored the presence of women through their art, thinking, and explored a range of feminisms and explorations of gender. It was curated by the three of us, Amy, Claire, and I, and it involved an enormous collaboration with writers and thinkers and artists, over 40 people, and then many more who were invited to make the paper with us in the public days at the Wellcome. So it was a kind of participatory or social sculpture project at the Wellcome. In this presentation, I'm going to outline some ideas for the project, and in particular, I'm going to look at problems associated with the archive, and this one in particular, and archives more generally. I'm going to go on to talk about the problems of language when working with gender or thinking about working with the word woman. And then I'm going to look at some of the issues faced by contemporary feminism. Sorry. And lastly, speak about what happened with the project. There was a kind of media furor around the use of the word woman with an X, and then we'll open up for discussion amongst us all. And we have had a really, it's been a really sort of strange time for the project, and so it would be really great to hear your perspective on what we should do next and how we should work to challenge the way institutions think critically about these discussions, and so that we can hope to open more space in institutions for these kind of works. Our initial project set out to examine the way women are represented in the archive. It came out of a project that Claire and Amy curated in 2016 called Walking Women, which aimed to challenge the typical representation in art history that walking art is a male terrain. We wanted to pick up and examine how that logic of erasure might work here within the Wellcome Collection archive. We were interested in how women are or are not written into the canons of history. And of course, because of our backgrounds, we were interested in art history or performance history, but we also wondered about how the archive is constructed, how knowledge is made through and by the systems that organize it. And we wondered what effects do the structures that are used to care for and house this knowledge have on the knowledge itself. We wanted to challenge the ongoing erasure of women artists, thinkers, theorists through the creation of new knowledge. And we wanted to attempt to embed this new thinking into the archive itself. So the idea of making the paper was to then leave that in the archive as a kind of different kind of trace. We had found that across the spectrum of work, women and their thinking is being erased, undervalued, or underrepresented. The original Walking Women project had at its centre a kind of Wikipedia project, and Wikipedia, whether you love it or hate it, is a really important online kind of way of accessing knowledge around the world, and it's the world's biggest online archive. It has a 90% male authorship, and then the way that sort of implicates women, it has a really big effect on the way women are represented. The rules for inclusion in Wiki's pages are set up to favour patriarchal forms of knowledge. There are particular criteria about notability, about the number of citations, the relationship between authors and subjects, and these criteria overtly value male knowledge over female. Through this project, we wanted to find ways to challenge these kind of structures, to think about how we create knowledge in different ways, to create citations for women and women artists and thinkers, and attempt to find more interesting models for inclusion. We also learned in this fact that the way in which our society values knowledge and it's the way it's produced and distributed is really problematic. So as part of our project, we spent a number of days in the archive at Wellcome, which was a really fascinating experience, and we had some brilliant help from the librarians and archivists there, and we met some really wonderful people who kind of took us in and said, this is our most contentious gendered material, and here you should have a look at it. The archive at Wellcome, as you may know, is a medical archive. It houses knowledge of bodies. It's a knowledge that has accumulated over centuries, and it contains both wonderful and horrifying materials. In our time there, we found that too often women are reduced to bodies. They are objects of study for a normally male scientific interest, and they're not valued for their thinking, knowledge, or their actions. And I'm going to show some examples of things we found, these kind of initial sort of starting points for our inquiries. So this is a woman. She was dissected in 1555. The description reads, anatomical dissection by Andreas Vesalius of a female cadaver attended by a large crowd of onlookers. The crowd is obviously all male. This is another image of a woman being dissected to discover the perfect proportions, the ideal proportions of a female. And it was directed by a man and overlooked by men. This was one of the most shocking images that we found as we searched for. There were 20 plates, and they reveal this kind of slightly fetishized way that these dissections happened. They show the archivists believe that this was probably a prostitute. In the first image, you can see that the skin is literally ripped away from the body, but there's a kind of slightly sexualized feel to the blanket and the kind of view. And then as it goes on, she becomes kind of like meat, and all of the organs are ripped back. And the archivists were particular in saying that the kind of final images where you can see the baby's really like in a very different kind of relief. It looks really kind of precious and cared for.
It looks like Hans Elm of a doll.
There's 20 of them, and they were done for this kind of male society, and the kind of the slightly lascivious language that's used to introduce them as well is sort of shocking. The next, sorry, I'll just go back here. This image is racially insensitive, and it was discussed in a presentation, a conference that was given, and there is an archivist at Wellcome who deals with racially offensive materials. And we were struck by the way people of colour are treated similarly by these systems in the archive, and the intersections of oppression seem to intensify the violence of this objectification. So this image, the description reads, which is offensive, a female Hottentot, possibly Sarah Baartman, with a disease which results in a protuberance of the buttocks due to an abnormal accumulation of fat. In this example, the researcher points out that not only is the word Hottentot incredibly offensive, but that the way that they describe the disease and abnormal in the description are really offensive as well, because this was a kind of normal figure for people of Southern Africa. So these descriptions also, the descriptions in the archive which have remained, and while the Wellcome is sort of talking about doing work to kind of fix the descriptions, these descriptions stay, and they aren't given any context, and they signify the way the archive kind of sets about to kind of inscribe normative or code normative values into the kind of way we receive knowledge. There is obviously an ongoing debate about archivists about what to do about this material. So that this shows that this same woman, this woman who's depicted here, was part of a touring freak show in England, which is also hideous. And that the only way that that's described is the most southern parts of Africa, in what was probably seen as in the less enlightened days of 1810 as a travelling freak show, where people from various racial backgrounds toured these show circuits dressed in traditional costume, entertaining people who had never seen other than local white people before, this woman, Sarah Baartman, was toured extensively and then subsequently dissected upon her death. The kind of way that this sort of stays in the archive without any kind of like problematic description is really troubling. And you know, the archivists are thinking about what to do. How do they, update their? There is this kind of question about how these offensive and exclusionary histories, should the archive remove them, or do we need to provide a more critical perspective in the descriptions and show how a contemporary audience might read them. So the next image is one that we included in the paper, and these are just some of the problematics in the archive. There's a lot more, and it's a really nice place to visit. You can go and have your own go. So this is an image by, she's an artist, Audrey Amos. We included this alongside a text by one of the archivists who's been working very closely with her archive. She's an artist. She'd been a promising student at the Royal Academy before suffering the first of many breakdowns and ending up in a psychiatric ward. And so for the rest of her life, Audrey spent time in and out of mental institutions, and she was given a string of diagnoses and medication, none of which she agreed with. For her, first and foremost, she saw herself as an artist and continued to develop her practice in the privacy of her home. So the archivists were then given her collection by her family on her death, and the archivists at Wellcome are really aware of the problems of archiving her work as an artist within a medical archive and about the risks of pathologizing her work. What we find again is the normative code embedded in the archive. It's in the systems of classification, it's in the way we access and receive information, and these are codes that we probably don't question enough. The archive itself is a part of a system of governance that keeps a social order in place. These archival systems find their roots in colonial reorganisations of the world, and for us they felt like they needed to be undone. Good luck. So I'm going to talk now about the problematics of language when working with gender, and quickly skim over lots of theory that lots of you probably know, but it's sort of important to kind of ground what we were thinking. A recent program called Fugitive Feminism at the ICA takes as a starting point the proposition that gender is an antagonism for black women because gender is constructed and reproduced in ways that can only name the experiences of certain kinds of women. Bell Hooks and Hortense Spillers provide some of the genealogical histories for this work. In her book, Ain't I a Woman, Black Woman and Feminism, Bell Hooks writes, in America, white racist ideology has always allowed white women to assume that the word woman is synonymous with white woman. For women of other races are always perceived as others, as dehumanized beings who do not fall under the heading woman. Hooks resists American feminist claims that solidarity between different kinds of oppression between white and black women in the US, and charts the way in which the word woman came to symbolically exclude black women. She insists in the final part of the book that resolution of the conflict between black and white women cannot begin until all women acknowledge, and this is a text from a while ago, so you know other people probably have different perspectives, but I think it's still really relevant. That a feminist movement, which is both racist and classist, is a mere sham, a cover-up for women's continued bondage to a materialist patriarchal principles and passive acceptance of the status quo. In Monique Wittig's essay under the title The Straight Mind, she sets out the problem of universality in which the straight mind develops a totalizing interpretation of history, social reality, culture, language, and all subjective phenomena at the same time. So I'm quoting here. She says that the consequences of this tendency towards universality is that the straight mind cannot conceive of a society in which heterosexuality would not only order all human relationships, but also the production of concepts and the processes which escape consciousness as well. And I think this kind of sort of heteronormative, or the normative force of in the archive, was something that we really found at Wellcome. We found that to be true. She claims also that straight society is fundamentally constituted on the necessity of difference of the other, that society operates through a power construction that constitutes difference in order to dominate it. She argues that also that it is not enough just to transform the economic relation within the system, but that new concepts are also needed to replace those that have a strategic purposes in upholding the straight patriarchal order. That to participate in the construction of gender is to participate in this power structure. At the end of the discussion, and it's quite a famous line, she says that lesbians are not women. In the footnote to that, there's a tiny footnote that says, and no more is any woman that is not in a relationship of personal dependency with a man. So really resisting the notion that woman is a name that we can call ourselves if we want to resist the patriarchal order. The arguments about the use of gender and sexual difference to demarcate power relations in society have their origins in the beginnings of capitalism, where, as Silvia Federici argues in Caliban and the Witch, processes by which women have been systematically oppressed and their knowledge outlawed was one of the main threads of the transition between feudal societies and capitalism. She describes this as a process of enclosure, a reorganization of knowledge and bodies for the purposes of extracting greater value from labour. In a brilliant lecture, which I really recommend watching and getting through, is which you can find online, by a theorist and writer of the book Towards a Global Idea of Race, Denise Ferreira da Silva lays out a theory for hacking the black female subject. She describes an equation which is incredibly complex, and I'm not going to try and re-perform it, but she says that in this equation she lays out this sort of the kind of ways of being and the kind of ways in which the patriarchal order constructs our idea of gender. And she says, being released from the necessity to ascertain or access truth, she says that this is, I find, the gift of the X, the possibility of being in the world anew, of becoming of and in the world, without the presumed necessity for resolution and determination, and thus without the modes of knowing framed in the logic of opposition. She recalls Wittig and ups the ante. Ferreira da Silva also offers a critique of universal reason in defining the role of the female. She says that in articulating the female role, we've always based that on the founding statements that postulate female subjection according to divine conceptions of the natural and the universal. In her far-reaching thesis, she finds that knowledge and truth are seen in the patriarchal worldviews to be located in this terrain of exteriority and in the realm of universal reason. It is this universalizing force that we encounter in the archive, especially here in this male-centered medical archive. The values of the archive are scientific and objective that serve to naturalize the subjection of women in the subaltern. She asks what sense can be gathered in the X? What are the possibilities for gender once liberated from the universalizing thinking of the patriarchy? Rather than dismantling the tools for thought, she calls for assembling the tools to live and think in the world otherwise. We worked with an artist, Jade Montserrat, in the paper, and she contributed an amazing kind of body of writing which we can show you later, but she's been involved a lot in calling out patriarchal structures that erase and exclude female knowledge, especially in the art world. She contributes in her essay in Daylighting, our capacity to love activates claiming possession of the world, articulated through dialogue, but calm and clear waters are for the few privileged. Silence is threatening. Why is language important? Why must we change it? Language represents the world. I'm now going to talk a little bit about the problematics of feminism. In recent times, feminism has become, well, it's maybe always been like this, but it's become a bit more of a contested ground. One of the reasons for our inclusion, we included a new piece of writing by the Feminist Duration Reading Group, is that we really appreciate the way this group explores underrepresented, non-canonical feminism that is read and then embodied in the group. The further we were along in making the project, the more we realised that the kind of category of woman, the kind of simple call to kind of, talk about the people, the women that you love, is actually a really complex process, and that kind of feminism has become really complex. So some of this was touched on in the paper that we shared by Jack Halberstrom, a chapter on trans feminism, which we shared. Public discourse in England has shown that a sort of dangerous form of feminism that seeks to exclude the perspectives of those that are not born female is on the rise. This feminism calls itself radical, it has a huge support and is very publicly critical of trans women. And this vocal minority has found a way to normalise hate speech in the name of voicing an opinion. Halberstrom touches on the vexed situation for transgender feminism. As we approach the third decade of the 21st century, the standoff between radical feminism and trans feminism continues to be represented as a live and urgent issue. In the chapter that we shared, Jack Halberstrom quotes Julia Serrano, author of Whipping Girl, who says that any new take on feminism must be capacious enough to include, recognise and celebrate the femininities of women who were not born female. Not only that, but the precarious femininity of trans women should be seen as the centrepiece of new feminisms and not as a negation of feminist politics. This reclamation is crucial to many of the feminist projects that were part of the project of daylighting. Reclaiming of bodies of knowledge, the inhabitation of other ways of thinking is one of the fundamental threads that connects the artists and thinkers that were represented in the programme. Halberstrom goes on to elaborate the struggle between trans and queer theories of gender, in which some trans theorists have argued that Butlerian notions of gender performance negates the very material desires and transformations through which trans people seek to express their gender identity. Butler has been criticised for creating an anti-trans queer theory in this kind of performative notion, but I think this is what Maggie Nelson calls a bad reading of gender trouble. In Undoing Gender, Butler insists that the suggestions that butch femme, I think this is what's important, is that all feminists are grappling with this, so it is kind of becoming really central, and how we think about this and how we sort of take this into our practices is important, you know, whatever you do. Is that the suggestions that butch, femme, transgendered lives are not essential reference for refashioning of political life and for more just, equitable society fails to acknowledge that the violence that the otherwise gendered suffer in the public world, fails as well to recognise that embodiment denotes a contested set of norms governing who will count as a viable subject within the sphere of politics. I think this is important for the archive. If we care for and house these normative values, what are the political ramifications for those that are otherwise to the norms? How might upholding these values and upholding and caring for this knowledge in this way create risk for our trans brothers and sisters? Other issues for feminism exist in alliances across generations, class and levels of privilege. One of the writers for Daylight is one of the kind of feminist thinkers in India who's working on the Me Too movement. And she writes in an essay where she describes the sexual violence that she's experienced, that it's easier to envision women's agency, be it intellectual, emotional, sexual, or financial, than to recognise the deep-seated malicious systems and bodies through which patriarchy is enacted every day, every minute. Some contradictions are overwhelming. How did we get this far and yet find ourselves exactly where we started? The real battle is how power and capital have co-opted the nuances of what it means to be feminist. Why bother about second and third wave feminisms? I'm drowning and you're just sitting there watching. You can read that in the paper. As part of making both the newspaper, so I'm going to now talk about what happened, switching from theory. As part of making of both the newspaper for Daylighting and the public programme, we worked with artists and thinkers from a range of disciplines, which included a number of trans and non-binary artists and women of colour. We worked with F Choir, which is a choir run by Jenny Moore, and it's a choir that's very clear about its openness to all genders. We invited UNC, a collective of artists who make amazing zines about female identity and race, to run a young person's workshop. The Women of Colour Index reading group, another reading group, was also in the programme, and they did a session with Joy Gregory. So the programme was filled with people that we loved and respected, and we felt very clear that one of the main drives for the project was a desire to articulate some form of resistance to the epistemic violence that seemed inherent in the normative values of the archive. When formulating a project about women or female knowledge, we felt that it was really important for the project to use language that would include lots of perspectives, and so we decided, clumsily probably, to use the word women with an X and woman interchangeably across the programme to represent the open and hopeful future towards which we were working. And we recognised that it wasn't perfect. One of the artists that we had asked to write for the newspaper was newly becoming a trans man, so the word woman or woman with an X was equally problematic or becoming irrelevant to him. But we settled on it as a compromise, mostly because the language we want to use doesn't exist yet, language that says people whose voices are not here. The potentiality of the X, the letter X is a slippery thing. It's hard to pronounce, and it has the potential for multiple meanings. We used it for its indication of a switch, a change, a fluidity, and an uncertainty. By placing the word in the word woman, we mean to create a hack in the word, to trumble the language of gender that is so fiercely defended. We can see that the construction of gender is part of the very fabric of the organising structure of the archive, and that these categorisations are employed to strategically exclude and patrol the boundaries of privilege. We agree that its unfamiliarity prompts pause, the challenge in pronouncing it, and I have said woman with an X the whole time, but other people say womanix and womxn. This was the starting point from which we began to develop and describe an inclusive reclamatory process, valuing embodied knowledge and staking a claim for visibility, shining a light on the overlooked and erased. The X is not about the inclusion of not only about the inclusion of trans women, though of course we welcome trans women into the work we were doing. The welcome was put together, so these are just some images actually that are in the paper. That should have been the slide from a while ago. So this is the Wellcome put together a very last-minute social media campaign, and without giving it much thought, they issued a tweet using the word women with an X, and their campaign didn't seek to contextualise the use of that word at all, or any of our thinking. Wellcome's Twitter account had an enormous backlash to the word from all across the spectrum. I think there's been another incident at Goldsmiths recently where a student union used the word, and it's been in the media as well, so it's kind of something that's being picked up a lot at the moment. MP Jess Phillips complained that trans women and women of colour are represented by the word woman and we don't need new words. They had over 100 responses, both from activist groups, which include the anti-trans hate group Fair Play for Women, who are kind of very well known and kind of police this, have a very public profile, and are very well funded as well. They had huge money around the GRA. They had they also had responses from like people just feeling confused because that was so badly sort of delivered. So at the same time, to us, it seemed that across Twitter, the use of the word women with an X was being picked up by campaigners against the GRA, the Gender Recognition Act, which was closing the weekend of our programme. So it was the kind of the sort of public consultation was closing on the 20th, and that was when our programme was happening. And on the kind of tweet, there was lots of pictures of kittens, and apparently that is a sign that there's trolling happening. Pictures of kittens, look out for those. That might mean that there's Russians involved. Wellcome really panicked at this. And despite kind of conciliatory language towards us and gestures that were, and promises that they were concerned about our artists and, you know, and wanted to make kind of the right kind of gestures towards us, they released the Wellcome's press team made a public apology without our consent, and it was mostly to appease the Twitter mob. This resulted in this very weird media storm that happened, and you know there was articles that were in the Boston Globe. It went kind of in this kind of weird viral thing, and we were asked. Every paper in the UK ran a story about whether language around women should change. The BBC Newsnight also ran a story in which they attempted a kind of balance, and they asked a transgender woman, Sophie Hope, who's a transgender politician in Brighton, to discuss the issue. She offered some words of support to the notion of inclusion, and in the days that followed, she received untold abuse online for her support of the use of the word. and in emails, and also for going on the programme and daring to represent womanhood. And we were in touch with her, and she told us that she had received death threats also by email. So it is a very violent time for people who are in the public and trans. At the same time, other venues, including South Bank Centre and Nottingham Contemporary, had also used the term. And Nottingham Contemporary used it for a really brilliant exhibition that I've not seen called Still I Rise. And the South Bank were using it for this poetry course, for a manual for women dreaming. And both of them, in the kind of wake of this Twitter storm, kind of reacted really differently, and each handled the media spotlight differently. South Bank really quickly removed the event, so you can still find this, but it clicks and goes nowhere. And solidarity. And Nottingham Contemporary stood ground in a really impressive way and clarified their views. They had a lot of backlash, but it is just Twitter, so you can kind of survive that. You can ride it out. And they did, and they also explained the use of the word in a really intelligent and articulate way, and defended it, which I think is the right thing to do. And if we'd had a more supportive press team at Wellcome, we would have asked to do something more like that. The apology that they made really played into the hands of the gender. Obviously, the gender police that were saying you can't use these new words felt like they'd won, and they were kind of cowing on Twitter. Like I got all of these messages saying, "Ha, very good, Wellcome. Now, will you ever work with this person again? She supports the GRA," on my Twitter account. It's kind of shocking to think that a kind of shutdown, that there is this entitlement to think that there's the shutdown of public debate. And then we felt like we were in a bind. We wondered whether we should cancel the whole programme, leaving lots of unprinted newspapers and artists with nothing to do for the weekend. Probably okay. But also letting a vocal minority of gender fascists win. So do we carry on? And that's how it felt to us. So maybe this language is a little bit inflammatory, but it really feels like that ideas are being policed in quite a dangerous way. And we found ourselves in this furor that reflected what the project was trying to resist. So we spoke to all of the artists, and one artist who strongly identified with the word women as a trans black artist, they decided to pull out of the programme, and they really said that they felt that Wellcome was erasing their identity, and that was really painful for us. The other artists in the programme all mostly said, kind of, I think after on reflection, we don't want to let the TAFs win. So we decided to go ahead with the programme because we had papers to finish and songs to sing, and Wellcome took over a week to finally agree to add a statement of inclusion back to their website. It was a really drawn-out process which felt to us quite deliberate, felt like a kind of way of holding us off while we kind of struggled with the kind of position that they put us in. And then on the day before, they wouldn't reinstate the word woman into the programme, and the day before the programme opened, they told us that there was to be a total social media blackout, and the programme would go ahead, but there'd be no publicity or promotion, and so we'd have to do everything kind of just by grabbing people and dragging them into the rooms. So for the first few hours after we opened the doors, I kept expecting to be met by a conversation with an angry radical feminist. But as the public days went on, we had a really lovely experience with the public, people who heard about the X debacle. Some people came to support the idea of trans inclusionary space. 2 young trans medical students came from Birmingham to be part of the work, and because they felt they really appreciated the efforts. A trans activist from Ghana came as she felt that the work that we were doing around the thinking of the archive as a colonial project was important. So people did come, and it wasn't packed because there was no sort of announcement of the programme at all, but the audience was there, and it was people who wanted to be there, and we had really interesting conversations with people about language and gender and how we've inherited a system that still feels like it needs to be dismantled. So these are some of the amazing artists that were in the programme and in the paper. And that I should say a little bit about what actually happened is that we commissioned 5 new pieces of writing for the newspaper and collected lots of found text that we felt represented different ideas about the body and different ideas about how women share and experience knowledge. And then we also had a sort of central spread in the paper where people could bring names of people that they wanted to daylight. They could bring people who they felt were underrepresented or not appreciated or not known about, and that we would print them we set up a kind of printing press room. We had an old-fashioned proofing press, and people could come and typeset a name of a person, I think, or an artist onto the tray, and we would print them. And then we were also printing kind of the rest of the paper, the covers, and we had 500 to do in a weekend, so it was quite busy. Keep pressing the wrong thing. This is some images from the paper. I think what might be good is if we invite Amy and Claire up, and just before I end, I wanted to end on this thought from Fred Moten and Stefano Hani from the Undercommons, because we think that perhaps the language doesn't yet exist to describe the political realities we want to see in the world. So in the meantime, we don't want to be correct, we won't be corrected. Politics proposes to make us better, but we were good already in the mutual debt that can never be made good. We owe it to each other to falsify the institution, to make politics incorrect, to give lie to our own determination. We owe each other the indeterminate, we owe each other everything. So yeah, I'm going to flick through some pictures, and then we're going to come up and have a quick chat about the kind of rest of the programme with Amy and Claire up here. So we could talk a little, because I've talked a lot, but Amy and Claire also worked on there might be things that you kind of want to say or talk about some of the yeah.
Sure. We don't have to use mics, do we?
Might be used.
Yeah. Do we? Okay. I was just going to add to that fabulous talking us through the ideas around it, but also what happened over the weekend, and this kind of was that one of the things that Wellcome said was that there was absolutely no more traffic to the website where we talked through the programme, the details of the artists we had commissioned. There was nobody, there was no added traffic to the site from the Twitter furore. So that the frenzy that was whipped up online as a result of the Twitter storm or stopped there. There was no engagement further with the programme itself or the ideas behind it or the questions around the word use, which I found so extraordinary at the time.
Yeah, and considering there were global news stories, as Maddie mentioned, I think only Newsnight and The Guardian actually contacted us to ask us anything about the programme itself. So again, I think that reveals a really interesting, incredibly superficial engagement with this idea of language and gender and the policing of bodies and words, which was really infuriating and disappointing that nobody, not just nobody bothered to find out what the work was actually about, but there was just no interest beyond that moment of reaction.
Yeah, and then also just the flip side of that was that was Wellcome's reaction. So when they apologised, profusely without running their words or anything past us in any way, which they had promised that they would do. They said they promised to us when we were together that they would run any reaction, all the wording past us, and then completely managed not to do that. But afterwards, I say to them, "So are you glad? Are you happy with how it's turned out?" And they were pleased that they had managed to kind of quell the storm as they saw it. That actually they had replaced a kind of calm working atmosphere, and that for them that was a good day's work. It was job well done. And we were left utterly stranded. The conversations weren't had. The artists were, some of them were left totally high and dry and stranded and worse, erased utterly. And none of the context was explored. None of the care or was given or even entered into and engaged. It was just great. Thank God that's over. Good job.
Yeah. I mean, I think it does say something about how much those kind of structures are protected. I mean, they wanted to make sure that they would still be kind of the people we worked with, just wanted to be respected. The next time that they had a big meeting with their boss, they wanted to know that, you know, they handled it well and they survived the storm, and really didn't, even though they wanted to have this program in, you know, they were very supportive of a Challenge the Archive program, they didn't want to deal with any of the political consequences of that or the kind of ramifications of that for the artists. And it is a very serious problem if institutions don't kind of accept the challenges that their kind of trendy, kind of, you know, slightly political programming is delivering. You know, there is a really big problem about the way public discourse is managed and governed.
I guess I think we felt like it revealed a desire to borrow the cool and edgy elements of challenging or political or disruptive programming without an actual willingness to engage with the disruption or the politics or the activism that might really cause in the real world.
Or the body, like all the bodies. There were people in the program who sent emails saying, "We feel erased by your apology," and that was one voice, and all of the people congratulating them for taking it down and making their apology. There were many more voices, and so that wasn't an equation for them. And yet that was a person that they were working with. They had taken into their employ that they should have been caring for first above the other people. So it is a shocking kind of it shockingly reminds you the world that we live in. Yeah, sorry.
No, not at all. I was just thinking, did you want to say something else, or we can open it up?
We could open up to questions. I think maybe that's
it was really that point of actually they were happy for us to trouble the context for a while, but only if it was within understood boundaries. We weren't allowed to rock their whole institution to its
And
core.
after it went sort of after it became difficult, you could feel the sense of, let's just make this a nice weekend and get them out of the building, and on Monday everything will go back to normal.
Yeah,
You know,
it was
the
really,
feeling all
that was
weekend.
very
It was
shocking.
quite-
I mean, I've experienced a similar thing recently. I wrote a piece about the erasure by an activist group of the work of an artist who had died of HIV/AIDS, and they complained that there was a statement about having AIDS, and they spray painted over that statement on a set of public posters because people don't get AIDS anymore, they live with HIV. Of course, that erases histories, it's in living memory. There are people alive who have lost people to AIDS. Equally, it makes an assumption that people have access to the drugs that prevent people developing AIDS. And I published a piece on it, and in the interest of being even-handed, a piece of a counter view was put forth that actually didn't engage with the arguments at all. It was really an exercise in the particular publication covering its arse in a similar way, because there were many problems with the argumentation in the response piece, and it was really there on the part of the group that had done the action, wanting to feel heard. And sometimes I feel like this is part of the problem that circles around what you're talking about, which is, it makes me think of something that Deborah Lipstadt, the Holocaust historian, said, which is the difference, why she won't debate with Holocaust deniers. And she says there's a difference between lies, facts, and opinions. And if one treats lies as if they're simply another point of view, another side of the story, they suddenly shift into being opinions, and they're given equal points of view. And I was suddenly thinking about, well, what does one do with the trans-excluding feminist? If your starting point is, I do not want this person to exist, or I do not want their existence to be acknowledged, what debate is there to be had? You know, around if I do not want trans women to be there. And similarly, you know, and if that becomes a debate, what are you then putting forth as another side of the coin, as another valid opinion, one that potentially rests upon the idea that somebody really shouldn't be there? And I think, you know, it speaks to prejudice, and what is prejudice? It's prejudgment. And as you rightly pointed out, nobody engaged with what you were doing. Nobody looked at it because they prejudged it. Yeah. They assumed to know what it's about. And that's a bit of a ramble, just to give you time to think up smart questions, which I'm sure you have lots of. Yeah, one over there.
I was really excited when I saw that this was the topic today, because I'm a trans man and I've had to deal with TERFs in my undergrad degree and everything else, and it's, you know, it's so awful. And obviously, like, part of my art and what I'm making is like, it's very much so like a personal narrative, and I want the visibility of my art out there, because I don't want anybody to grow up the way that I did, because like I'm so happy with the decisions I've made, where I'm at in my life. But you know, it's just so heartbreaking that even like in this, you know, setting of art and curating, it's like that you're still running into that trouble. And I guess like, what advice would you give when you know, combating with galleries and things like that in that setting? Because it's, I don't know, it just needs to be talked about, because it's like, I'm from the United States too, and like the more that it is a race, like the more violence that trans people are facing like every day, like even like within
I mean,
that's
I think why this sort of slightly clumsy way of using this kind of idea of gender fascism feels relevant, because there is this very real risk to people's lives. The trans man that was in the program felt really under threat, because he was in China at the time when this was all kicking off, and he was like, you know, just transitioning, and I don't want to have to deal with these kind of, I don't want to be public. He was saying he didn't want to be public because it was too new and nascent for him. He felt at risk because of visibility. And I think that's one of the things with the whole idea of the kind of concept of daylighting something, is that actually visibility can be a risk. And so you kind of want to balance the kind of making visible with sort of some sort of protection. And I don't know. But I also think that I hope that in the art world, you know, in the worlds of galleries, and you know, that there are, you know, we want to use this opportunity to push for better ways that institutions work with trans communities. And that's really, really important, that if that isn't something that we get out of it, we'll feel even greater sense of loss. So we are trying to suggest to Wellcome that they run a kind of something similar that happened after there was a Plan B kind of debacle at Baartman, and then they ran an open space with lots of institutions came and kind of discussed what the best practices around, this was to do with colonialism, but this sort of similar way of kind of, you know, we've been sort of pushing them. South Bank, Nottingham contemporary people who are kind of implicated in this should get together and decide how they better respond to these kind of incidences, because they, you know, they shouldn't have let TERFs win. They just shouldn't have let. That's just not on.
And it's that difference between structural change, which is needed, and the idea that this can just be a kind of adjunct program.
Yeah.
As long as it goes okay, we look progressive. But if we need to make structural change, you know, that involves dealing with challenges and challenges.
Yeah. One of the things that was really interesting when we insisted on a kind of open platform was that they said, no, what we should do is we'll call everyone individually and then we'll get their feedback and we'll write it down on a piece of paper and then that will be a way of... And I was like, no, that's just managing your risk. That is just managing your risk of being embarrassed in front of a big group of people. But you should take that on. Like, you should, sorry.
No, exactly that. But the questions for us is, how do we push for institutional change? And which institutions are prepared to take it on? And if that's now, then at the moment, the place that is going to house the next conversation around this is the Live Art Development Agency. But they are used to having these conversations, with absolutely being at the forefront of these conversations and questions and difficulties and dangers. They house vulnerability safely, and they are used to it. So one of the things that we didn't want to do was to only have that. I mean, they're ready for that. But what we want to have is those conversations in the South Bank, which so clearly were not happy to have it. They silently took it down overnight. It was so depressing. So to have that conversation in Wellcome is the next plan, but also then, like Maddie was saying, a wider, larger forum. So we're talking to many people about how we can make that happen.
I just wanted to mention something around what we do with this historical, violent, exclusionary sort of frameworks that we're all under. And I started thinking around maybe the response, to this idea of universality. There are responses in radical anthropology, which is the idea of the pluriverse, that we have more than one cosmovision, and that perhaps could start stirring the sort of the Christian spell, like the white patriarchal colonial Christian spell that we're all under. And I'm, in my own kind of research, I'm heading towards that direction, and it's causing, it's almost like going into metaphysics, I think that we deal with these issues towards a sense of redemption. We're trying to resolve the violence, then the guilt that violence caused, and then we want to be redeemed. And that is a very Christian cycle. And with that, we're not escaping the white patriarchal colonial force that inscribes all of this vicious cycle. So we're not really kind of stepping out. And I think we can start stepping out with other cosmovisions, that Amerindian, Andean cultures, for example. And I think going towards a new cosmovision through, any of these groups can maybe be very revealing as to, attempting these quite complex situations that we're inhabiting.
I mean, there are all the kind of knowledges that were lost in the archive as well. The kind of, well, not lost, but kind of misrepresented, repressed, sort of turned around, and in my country, the one that I was born in, it was very violently erased. There's a very violent process of dispossession that's still going on, and that So I completely agree with you. Denise Ferreira da Silva really talks about the idea of a kind of like within her essay Separability Without Difference. Difference without separability is this idea of a kind of a non-located kind of collective being that sort of changes it. And our paper was an attempt at that as well, a kind of open platform for different kinds of thinking, a kind of mapping of thinking rather than a single view, a kind of plurality of thought rather than a fixed position. And that kind of non-locality kind of guides the practice in some ways.
I just wanted to say, I find it so kind of almost impossible to escape like patriarchal dominance. And I think we're all attempting towards that, but I think we keep on returning to that system very unconsciously.
Yeah,
because to me, I just want to bring the word of redemption again. Redemption has to do with Christian metaphysics, We want to be redeemed of our violence and of our history. And I'm really kind of curious as to how we can move away from redemption and perhaps into a new zone. And maybe again, like going back to the Amerindians, maybe they have, you know, these cultures may have another way of dealing with, let's say, violence or guilt. And because I think, you know, Western history is exactly that. It's violence, guilt, redemption, and then again, violence is a cycle that doesn't quite end.
Yeah.
Slightly tangentially, some of our very interesting conversations at Wellcome were with the archivists and librarians who we had planned to do a discussion with, really talking about the taxonomies and the classification systems that they work with and how they were aware of the restrictions and the systemic reproduction of those patriarchal and colonial systems, that those very processes of classification and cataloguing required of them in relationship to the materials that they were working with. Unfortunately, that session was postponed. They didn't feel happy to go ahead.
They were too scared of the turfs.
They got too scared of the turfs, but we hope that that's something that we'll return to with them.
They were worried, but they felt really ill-equipped to have that discussion in the arena that they then would have been in to have it.
And I think
I do think that actually they were very careful, the archivists and librarians, to say this is a postponement. That for them, they were really, I felt super supported by them, and they were really keen to have these conversations around the difficulties that they come up against every single day, I think, working in that institution in particular. Do you want to?
Sure, you're not being a bit too generous about the archivists?
Yes.
I don't know them personally, but it sounds to me that they were just doing what your curators and the people who invited you in to do, which was dropping you when things got difficult. And I think,
I think they were scared to be performing this institutional critique from within the institution. And to be honest, I think they wanted to not risk their jobs as well. And you know, I like them, and but I did feel that they were the spies in that. We tried to put together a statement that would go in the centre of the paper, and we had so many others that we were working with that we kind of just like put it in a Google Doc and sent it out to everyone. And by the end, this statement became so kind of filtered down that we were like, this is ridiculous. We did print it, but it sort of didn't go into the paper. And the archivists were part of the program, so we sent it to them, and they dobbed on us. They told the head of live programming that dobbed is such a stupid word, but they told the head of live programming that this statement was getting a little bit radical and that people were trying to say that the institution was oppressing them. And I was like, well, that, you know,
that is what's happening.
This is a paper that's not yet printed. You know, this live stuff is happening. You wanted this to happen. And they asked us, the head of live programming said, please don't print that because my job is at risk. And because the archivists were included, their voice needed to be included in the statement, so the statement kind of collapsed. So this sort of, it is problematic, I think, to resist those processes from within the institution. I think that's what you're talking about about redemption, is that there is no redeeming the situation. There is no, we can say to Wellcome, you should do something about this, but there isn't. We all feel differently about this too. Like, we have different relationships to people, and you know, I'm a lot more critical, but
One of the problems with redemption.
No, go ahead.
One of the problems with redemption is also the idea that it promises resolution. We will be freed from this trouble. Actually, there will be no uncontested or totally representational category. New subjects, new ideas, new ways of moving in the world will always be invented. So we have to live with the fact that these will be risky, constantly risky, and unresolved and debated things. It's whether or not people are willing to have the debate.
And it's also about whether, if you're prepared to challenge what an archive does, whether it can be more open, porous, fungible, taking things in and rejecting, kind of whether the archive has a critical perspective. is the job of the archivists. You know, that is their job. So the kind of pushing for that is through them, you know, and obviously, I mean, the kind of systems of classification that they introduced to us, they said this sort of male system of classification was made in, it's a Baartman system of classification. It's only used in medical archives, and it's very outdated, but it means that everything has to be classified according to the medical causation of it. So it's like everything is sort of, has this taxonomy that only works if everything is pathologized. So the kind of pathologizing force of their job is really something they have to contend with every day. And, you know, there does need to be more thinking about it, you know.
Sorry. I mean, I think we all did feel slightly differently about things. I think that we really came from a very different point of view to the archivists and librarians who are not used to being front-facing, who are not used to talking to the public, apart from, yes, I can show you, you know, they'd first talked to you, Claire, and said, oh, let me show you this, and this incredible way of, they are the interface between people who come, visitors to Wellcome, and what is the incredible information that is held in there. They are the people through whom we find out the incredible information, because usually, often, they're very small words. One of the questions for us was, how do you access the information that you know is in there somewhere, but you don't know what it is? How do you find it? And they're one of the ways into finding it. But they were in no way prepared as people to be put in the position that they felt that talking in that arena, and they were, you know, would have put them. I mean, just to support them a little bit on that. But that actually, one of the things that you said at the beginning of the talk was about this sense of the code of the archive itself, the way it's written, but also then that also feels to me about talking about online code of the algorithms that are written for us every day about what we want or might want or what other people want us to want, and when we access anything online. And this sense of trying to code break as well is really can be incredibly challenging, and I think it's best done from the outside, actually, that actually there were incredible challenges, and even for them, one of whom was in charge of problematic material. You know, she was going to talk, Erika was going to talk, and, you know, so she should have been more able to have that conversation, and she didn't even feel able to do it. So, you know, that was our job, but really the whole institution had to change in a way that it wasn't able to. We need to change the conversation.
Thank you for the talk. What interests me somehow is like how this very unfortunate situation for you, in a way, like where you're right now, like in a way you're sitting here presenting, making it public to us here at Goldsmiths, probably through other channels. But what I'm kind of curious is like where you left. So Wellcome basically closed down the case by just taking everything off online, or like taking all the traffic down, and then you were basically sent out of the museum. And I'm kind of curious what you right now, what you take out of it, or what you kind of, you know, like if this is kind of fuel for you to just say like, hey, we're just gonna fight even harder, or in a way, like what kind of conclusion you had now from this case, how to, for next time, or like how to make this public, or how to bring this discussion up. Like there was this mentioned this seminar with the other institutions, but that in a way from a personal, I think also for you personally, how what you get out of it, you know? Or like not out of it, but how you think to process further, like working with the archives and cases like that.
Just to say from a personal perspective, I feel it's very unresolved, and I feel in some ways quite uncomfortable with my desire to make everything okay as well. I recognised in the behaviour of the people that we were interacting with on a personal level elements of my own sort of desire to smooth things, to make things okay, and also really felt within myself an absolute point of I don't want to work like this in future. Being happy and feeling okay is not the overarching goal of art. It feels very important to me to return to this and think about those discomforts and those problematics and those challenges and those arguments, and also to think about my place of privilege within those as well. You know, how unrisky it was for us in so many ways, and yet, yes.
That's what feels shocking.
Yeah. Did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I think that I would echo a lot of what Claire has just said. I think that in much the same way that the librarians and archivists faced the choice of whether to be public in their debate, we were invited onto Newsnight and we said no. And I still think it was probably the right decision. It's really difficult to know, but it still feels really sick making that.
I think it was a bit quick, the whole going on to news. Anyway, that feels like a different thing.
But we had a whole choice and to be really, really public about things, or to, or we would just, we were placed in a really difficult position, and we felt very silenced and completely unsupported by the people that we were working with, and it was a really shocking position to be put in. Between us and the artists, and trying to support them and us, and still have an extraordinary conversation about work that we felt very strongly about, and yet I now cannot use the word women with an E and feel like it's in any way representative, or it feels like it's a hole down which I could totally disappear. We could all, the whole, it's changed forever. So we have so much thinking and writing and exploring to do together, because our whole language is gone, as well. So we're just thinking that through.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important. Like, to me, it does feel like it should feel other thinking. It should feel that.
Yeah.
This is, a kind of, not necessarily the kind of turf thing, but the kind of rich theme of like why is it that institutions can't face it? I mean, it's not just institutions, is it? It's like these colonial systems that we find in the world everywhere. We're kind of, there's all of these threads that we kind of have to keep pulling at, and if there are other ways to keep pulling at them, and this only became a kind of big deal because of this weird. We didn't expect any of the stuff around the woman thing to be an issue, really. Like, just some thinking that we've been doing about language. It just doesn't feel like that would have been the problem. Actually, the kind of questions about whether an archive is a colonial force is more challenging, I think, but no one even thinks about that, and that seems problematic to me.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, because I've been trying to grapple with a similar thing in my recent project of my own. I was kind of wanted to ask whether in a project that's about giving voice to marginalised narratives, like how do you kind of reconcile your own curatorial work and as a form of authorship in itself? Like, I think as Simon said in our first lecture in this series, for every selection there is a deselection. And I just wanted to ask about some of your tactics about the in this project.
I really struggled with this as soon as we kind of felt like, you know, if the archive is kind of, we aren't the people. This is the other thing, is that we're not necessarily so inviting kind of the people that we felt were, you know, the kind of voices we felt like that was how we would address it. So, and, you know, Amy and Claire are artists and academics as well as, you know, performers, and I'm a writer as well. So, like, the curatorial frame is something that we just sort of borrow a bit when we're doing projects, but also move into other ways of working. And so it's, I mean, I think that for me it doesn't seem that this project was about representing marginalised voices. It was about a kind of daylighting the structures that formulate those oppressions. And that's a different perspective than saying, I really want to just work with Indigenous Australians, and like saying that that's what I'm going to do, because that's a different way of working. I think we wanted to work on something, and then we found the artists that we felt were asking those questions too, and that could answer them. And for us, it was just about how do we ask those questions, and then how do we find artists who can kind of frame things around that in a way that they would find interesting and that we could publish. And you know, their work is already about that, and it's great. So let's ask them to do that. And to be honest, when I think about curating, it's you know, these are just my friends mostly. It's like these are friends and these are conversations. And if you read the paper, that's how it comes across, is that these are conversations that's like having a conversation with a friend, because that's how some of those conversations work. And so some of the very close pieces in the paper are like friendships, you know. And so I think that's a really good basis for curatorial practice. Oh,
No, I was just going to...
And these are my friends too.
Yeah.
But I won't let them speak.
Before we close up, I might ask you a difficult question that was sort of skirted around in the presentation, which is the question of, you know, this is a whole project around questions of erasure. On the one hand, the ways in which women, people of colour, have been erased from the archives, even as knowledge has been produced about them, and how other knowledges that might come from those people are also erased. And as a consequence, you were accused of a form of erasure of women themselves in trying to be too inclusive. But I suppose that the thing that undergirded it was whether or not you deaccession and remove material like the Hottentot Venus, like that. You know, I suppose, where do you stand on the question of not forgetting historical abuses? How do you manage history whilst also not reproducing it, I guess? And where do you stand on the idea of removing things from the archive?
I think removing things from the archive is a kind of rewriting of history and a censorship of our actions that might make some sort of sense to thinking in the moment, but that will effectively, for future researchers, just completely erase the facts of what went on. I don't think it's the answer to remove or erase.
But I also think archives, I mean, that's possibly true, and I think that possibly removing things, restoring things to their ownership is a different question. But that it is the job of an archive to be open to new ideas, that the ideas that are being represented in an archive feel like they need to, it's the job of an archive to sort of adjust itself. I want an archive that is definitely more open and generous and open to change. And I mean, that's the problem with that, is that there's such a contested idea about even the word woman in the world at the moment, that then who gets to say what is generosity, who gets to say what is flexibility, who gets to say what is porousness. I don't know.
And I also wouldn't want to erase archives. This whole work began as when Claire began it with the first one with Walking Women, to counter a kind of lazy curation that doesn't delve far enough into archives, that just sits with the same old names, just taking them out again and again. And for Walking Art, Richard Long, you know, it's like, oh, we'll just get, Hamish Ford, great, Ian Sinclair, brilliant, and it was infuriating to hear this repetition that just sticks names further into people's minds. It's rude and lazy and infuriating. So that was the whole point of Daylight, to look a bit closer, to ask different people to look into the archive, and to see different things from the things that are continually aired and brought out for our attention. So I don't want to erase things. I just want to have a look at the different things that are out there here from everybody else. It's just a question of sifting in a different way and being more proactive and working a little bit harder for your information and doing your work better.
We can do better with feminist exhibitions than always having Anna Mendieta or Judy Chicago with the same few names.
That's true too.
Not that there's anything wrong with Anna Mendieta or Judy Chicago. Anyway, I think that was a really brilliant presentation that linked the theoretical, this questions of universality as itself a patriarchal violence, and then how you negotiated that in your practice, and the conflicts that come from failures to be universal or deliberate refusals to be. I think it's incredibly brave and brilliant of you to speak here so eloquently about something that's obviously so traumatic. I presume that by hosting you, none of us will work as curators again either. Since it was suggested that you'd be blacklisted. But I think we're okay with that. We're prepared to stand up for what we think.
If I just say another thing, it may have been traumatic, but actually, God, if it begins a question, if it begins another way of thinking about language, if it's, you know, it wasn't us who came up with the word, you know, but if there was an explosion and that leads to different language, then bloody great. You know, that's the point of it.
Yeah. We have to be prepared to be collateral damage to things we believe in potentially sometimes.
Collateral damage to change.
Yeah.
T-shirt.
Well, thank you very much. It was a wonderful presentation. I think we should all thank the speakers.